If we could just start with Victoria, and perhaps you could talk a bit about how you initially thought about it, and it was your first screenplay, and how you conceived the subject, and just a bit about your initial thinking about using Victoria as a historical drama.
Well, my relationship with Victoria has been it's been going on for about 40 years. So I discovered Victoria when I was a student at Cambridge University, and I was reading history, and I'd grown up in London, and at that point, to me, Victoria was a sort of basically an old boot in a bonnet. You know, she was this kind of grumpy old woman whose stern, forbidding features gazed out at you everywhere in London, wherever you went, you know. And I used to cycle past her, kind of that great wedding cake outside of Buckingham Palace, where she's sort of sitting there scowling. I must say, at that point, I thought Victoria was really everything I wasn't interested in. It meant heavy furniture and draped piano legs and general sort of prudery and repression. But then I go to university, and I decide to take a special subject taught by the wonderful David Cannadine, who, this is a history festival, I'm sure you all know who he is, and it was called Queen Victoria and the Media. And as part of my reading list, I had to read Queen Victoria's diaries, not all of them, but certain volumes of them. So I go to the Cambridge University Library, and I take out volumes of Queen Victoria's diaries, which are big Morocco-bound leather things, and I've got this sort of pile of them on my desk, and it's very quiet in the reading room, and I'm looking at them and thinking, oh Lord, do I have to really do this? Anyway, I pick one up, and it opens at November the 5th or November the 4th, 1839, and I start reading, and I realise as I read it that Victoria is about 19, the same age as I am, and she's just got engaged to Albert. And she's writing about Albert, and she's saying they're inspecting, you know, the 11th Hussars or something together. And she writes about how Albert looks so fine in his white cashmere breeches, nothing under them, and high boots. And I just thought, wow, you know, this is not the Victoria I was expecting. I'd been, you know, and I suddenly realised it was a kind of epiphany for me, because instead of this grumpy old bag, here was this kind of passionate young woman who was really into men, parties, dancing, and, you know, all the things that I too was into at that time, clearly. And so it was just a sort of, I just sort of thought, I made a connection, as they say. And so later, many years later, when I'd made thousands of hours of television factual programmes, I'd written a couple of novels, and my second novel, called The Fortune Hunter, which is about the Empress of Austria, Queen Victoria had sort of wandered into that book, and I found it sort of spookily easy to write in her voice. My husband would have a theory about that, but we won't go into that. And I thought, what am I going to do now? I'd sold my company. Let's put it this way. The people who'd bought my company had realised that they no longer had need of my services. So I was footloose and fancy free, and I thought, what am I going to do now? And I thought, I'll write a novel about Victoria, because she comes easily to me. And I had a teenage daughter at the time who was 15, and like Victoria, she's 5'0", and, you know, passionate and sort of, you know, full of sort of bursting with hormones. And I suddenly had this vision of, can you hear me? I suddenly had this vision of what it would be like for, you know, this teenage queen, you know, for this teenage girl to wake up one morning like my daughter, bursting with hormones and passionate and all of that, tiny, to wake up one morning and to find that she's the most powerful woman in the world. And not only that, what would it be like for her mother? And that, I thought, was the basis of a drama. So I thought, well, rather than write a novel, rather than finish the novel that I'd started, I will write a drama. And so I'd never written a drama before, but I had the complete confidence of total ignorance. So I just thought, I'll be able to do this, it'll be fine. So I started writing a drama, and I met an agent, I met a producer, and it all happened in the most, as if it was meant to happen. So I found myself never having written a drama before writing this series about Queen Victoria. And I must say it's been the most utter joy to do, because not only has it been, there is no greater feeling than, sitting in a read through and having all these wonderful actors read your words, but it's a time period I find fascinating, with huge kind of crossover with the present. I don't know if any of you've seen the third series, but the character of Palmerston and the current British Prime Minister are cut from the same cloth, to put it mildly. And it's just been, I've had so much fun doing it. So I've been very blessed. So it just goes to show that, a university education is not wasted,
Thank you. We were talking a bit about the diaries earlier, and I don't know if many of you know about Queen Victoria's diaries, but perhaps you could just talk a bit about them as a source and what you found in them, because they were famously edited by her daughter.
So Queen Victoria was an indefatigable diarist, and somebody who, had nothing better to do, has worked out that she wrote 62 million words in her lifetime, which, if you think the average novel is about 150,000 words, that's a lot. And so she started writing her diary when she was about 12 or 13. And her early diaries, before she becomes queen, were obviously written. They're not the diaries of a teenage girl, because they're written, she knows that her mother or her governess is going to read them. And so they're all, they're quite worthy, but they're vivid. And, there's wonderful descriptions of going through the Black Country and seeing these sort of, ragged children, crawling about in ash heaps, and then these incredible sort of explosions of kind of the iron ore smelting factories behind them, and they're very well observed. But then when she becomes queen, there's a kind of 3 years between becoming queen and marrying Albert, where she's writing for herself, and these really are her diaries. And those are literally the diaries of a teenage girl with the most humongous crush on the man she calls Lord M. And literally every entry is something like, Lord M and I talked today about earrings. He doesn't like earrings. He thinks they're barbarous. He likes me in blue. He thinks I asked Lord M today if he thought I was getting fat. He said, yes, you are getting rather fat. Maybe you should take more exercise and eat less. And she goes, but I'm always hungry. So it's full of stuff like that. It's hilarious. And anyway, and those are the most engaging and charming bits of her diaries, those 3 years. And then after that, when she marries Albert, I'm pretty sure Albert's reading her diary. So that, I think, explains the enormous amount of my darling, darling Albert, my dearest, dearest angel, angel Albert, which goes on for pages and pages and pages. Because I think that when they had a row, neither of them wanted to kind of back down. So she would write lots of lovely things about him in the diary, knowing that he was going to go away, he was going to read it. So that was her way of apologising. And then, of course, when she died, Beatrice, her youngest daughter, went through her diaries and copied them all out and left out anything that she thought was too salacious. So that probably was anything to do with John Brown, anything to do with any of the children, what Victoria really thought of her children. And so, from Albert's death onwards, the diaries are pretty heavily edited. And of course, we all, every Victorianist is desperate to get their hands on the unexpurgated diaries. Whether they would have been that saucy, I don't know. But I there are lots of things I'd love to know. Anyway, so that's what happened to the diaries. But I think if you read the diaries as a novelist, which I am, rather than as a historian, you do get an extraordinary sense of the woman. And they're all available online. Queen Elizabeth has put them online. It's called Queen Victoria's journals.org.uk. So you can read them, and quite often, I would go into Jenna Coleman's trailer, who plays Queen Victoria, and she'd be reading the diary entry for that day, and it's a great way of sort of remembering that you're writing about a real person and what her sort of insights were. And she was an extraordinary woman. She was very, very, very curious. And that's one of the things I love about Victoria, is that she's always interested in what's going on around her. You might say nosy, her children might say nosy, but I say curious. And I think her curiosity is the thing that makes her so fascinating.
Thank you. This brings us on to the subject of writing history, writing novels and writing screenplays, and where you take a dramatic license, or perhaps you could talk a bit about how you've maybe altered the history to fit the story, or I mean, it's not pure history, but it's pretty close.
Yes, I mean, I did read history, so I have some respect for what happened. But as I read more and more about Victoria, I realised that in effect, every historian writing about Victoria is to some extent telling a story. And it's an interesting thing, what's the story you want to tell? And there are people who want to tell the story of a sort of a stubborn, opinionated woman who gets in the way of all the men who want to reform the country for the better. There are histories written of Victoria which sort of suggest that she's a kind of a hysterical woman. There's a lot of that, actually. And so I think I've come to it really trying to get a sense of who she was, and putting Victoria, the woman, in the centre of it. And it's difficult sometimes because people have these preconceptions of her, and you think, and people have criticised the series because Jenna Coleman's too pretty to be Queen Victoria. But my feeling about that is that if you have Queen Victoria in the room, she's going to be the person everybody's looking at. There's no question that she's going to be the most interesting person in the room. And how do you convey that on screen? Well, you have somebody who you want to look at, and that is Jenna Coleman. If you really want to know what Queen Victoria really looked like, you should look at pictures of Princess Beatrice, the daughter of the Duke of York. She is an uncanny kind of ringer for Queen Victoria, the overbite and the sort of slightly bulging blue eyes. That's what Queen Victoria probably looked like, I think. It's funny how faces come back in families, and I think that's where... Once I met her once, and I was just like, oh my God, this is extraordinary. You look so like her. But I think it's a difficult thing, the kind of fact and fiction thing. What I've tried to do is to stick to the facts. So there's very little in Victoria that I've made up, in the sense of, I don't, if the Crimean War happens, I can't, if we lose a battle, I don't say that we've won it or something like that. But what I've tried to do is to fill in the gaps, because narratives, as anyone who's tried to tell a story, narratives don't always, the facts don't always fit the story in the way you'd like them to do. And when you're writing a screenplay, you have to, everything in it has to mean something. It all has to be part. It all has to point to some sort of, emotional narrative. So I've tried to kind of keep it as close as I can to the actual truth, but I've also tried to, where I can, where I stray from it, point to higher truths. So... to more profound truths. So, for example, in the episode I wrote about the Irish famine, I was, I used a bit of my own personal history there, because I had written a book about 20 years ago about my great-great-great-grandfather, who was called Dr. Trail, who was the rector of Schull, just down the road. And he was an extraordinary man who had he'd been a very evangelical Protestant. He'd been very, very anti-papist, as he called it. But yet, in the famine, he'd sort of seen that there was a cause greater than all of the religious differences. And he had devoted himself to trying to get the British government to realise what was going on in this part of Ireland and to do something about it. And he wrote these incredibly impassioned letters to the Times, which are extraordinary documents. And I thought, this is such a good story. And, here is a way of telling a really big story in a very personal way. So I used that story And I had him come to London and meet Victoria, none of which actually happened. But I needed to kind of explain it in a way that made dramatic sense. And I think it did. And I think certainly the reaction to the programme in England was extraordinary. And one of the things I found so surprising was that people kept saying, "Did you make this up?" And I was like, no. Honestly, this is a really tame version of what happened, because we couldn't afford, the sort of proper extras that we needed. I mean, trying to find people who look that thin is very hard. Can you imagine? Trying to find extras who it's one of the hardest things we've ever had to do. So we had to sort of we gave just a tiny flavour of what happened. But, certainly when the show went out in England on Twitter, people were just like this, they couldn't believe how bad it was. So I felt that, in a way, the inaccuracies there were justified by the bigger picture, which was to make people aware of what had happened in Ireland in 1846, 1847, 1848. And it was... so I used that story, and I hope I used it. I hope, I took some liberties, but I think there was a good reason for taking those liberties.
As we've come on to the local connection, perhaps you could talk. You talk in your book Silver River about finding out about Robert Trail, which was obviously not when you were writing Victoria. It was many years before that. Perhaps you could talk a bit about discovering this sort of part of your family history and your visit to the library in Skull. And
yes, well, my career is one of total just recycling stuff I've done earlier. Here's one I prepared earlier. So basically, I wanted to write a memoir, and it was really a book about my mother. And to do that, I felt I should look into the family history. And luckily, someone had done all the sort of really hard work, and they'd kind of done a family tree. And I realised that my grandmother's, who was born in Argentina's grandfather, had been born in here in Skull. And I was looking at it, and then I read a little bit about Robert Trail, and I realised he was the rector of Skull, and I didn't quite know what that meant. I mean, this is, I was a historian. I really should have known better. I didn't really understand what being an Anglo, rector of the Church of Ireland in the middle of West Cork in the 1830s and 40s, what that meant. But then when I came to Skull, and this was in 98, I realised very quickly, because I walked into the bookshop in Skull and I said, "Do you know anything about Robert Trail?" They went, "Oh, the Reverend, yes. He still rode his horse in the famine." And that was like, and it took me a while to realise what she was saying, the bookshop owner, and as I realised, it was extraordinary to me that it was like, these were events that had happened 150 years ago. They were still really quite fresh in the memories of the people I talked to. And so I tried to find out a little bit more about it, and everyone said, "Oh, well, you'll have to read is it the Mizenhead Historical Journal?" And then I went to the Skull Library and they didn't have it, but they said, "Oh, well, Mrs. somebody or other will have it." And she lived in a sort of bungalow on the northern outreaches of town, and I went there, and she was the daughter of the Manse, and her father had been a rector of the Church of Ireland. And not only did she have the historical journal, she also had my great-great-great-grandfather's diary, which was incredible, this incredible document. And so I was able, diaries are so wonderful.
It's another diary in your life.
Yeah, another diary, exactly. And, and it was the most extraordinary thing. I found this diary belonging to this man. And the diary was mostly in the 1830s, where he had been a rabid anti-papist and talked about heathens worshipping a rock and all this kind of stuff. And it also talks about, terrible sadnesses about, he had 2 children that had died, very early on, and he talks about they'll be much happier now they're with God. And you're thinking, oh, my wife doesn't really agree. And you just think, oh, you get so much from what he doesn't say. And then I discovered that during the famine he had, he went against the wishes of his bishop, and he turned his rectory into a soup kitchen, and he put all his money into, feeding his parishioners, Catholic or Protestant. And in the end, he actually died of famine fever. And his family, his wife, his widow, and his 5 children went back to Dublin, and the Church of Ireland sued them for the damages done to the rectory when it was a soup kitchen. And that I thought was the sort of killer detail, actually. And it's an extraordinary story, and you realise, it's a very human story, and it meant a great deal to me finding out about that, and so I was determined when I wrote Victoria not to forget Ireland, because it's such an important part of the 19th, the Victorian era, and yet it's always kind of, it's in a box on the side of the page, and I thought it was very important that it be a sort of integral part of the story. And, and Victoria, she's, I think, rather unfairly called the famine queen, because, she was the first monarch, of course, to come to Ireland, the first British monarch to come to Ireland since God knows when. I mean, I don't know who did before that. And she wanted to be queen in Ireland. She wanted to be the queen here, as well as everything else. And I don't know. I mean, apparently when she came to court, there were crowds of cheering people. Who knows why they were cheering? But I mean, at least she made the effort to come, which none of her predecessors had done.
And when you wrote Robert Trail into the series, presumably you would have put the famine in, even if you hadn't had a family connection.
Oh, of course.
But did you do it in an educational way because you knew about the level of knowledge? Did you feel that you had a role to sort of make sure it was included?
Yes, I mean, I felt quite passionately, actually, that it was terribly important that people understood what had happened, and that they, in my own very small way, I could help educate people in that, because I do think, the famous thing about if we don't know the past, the lessons of the past, we're condemned to repeat them. And, I think there is a wider question here, is that the British generally are pretty ignorant of Irish history, and it comes as a terrific surprise to them that the Irish that there are problems connected with Ireland, entirely of our own making. So not all of them, but a great deal of them. So I think it's that makes me sound more crusading than I am, but I thought it was terribly important to try and put this into a story about royal life, because actually, it's something that's incredibly important. And although Victoria may have only put £2,000 of her own money into the famine relief fund, at least she did something. And unlike her government, who were, when you read what Trevelyan writes about, basically, this being natural wastage, the people dying in the famine, it's really terrifying. And you can decide, you could compare it to some of the things that Ian Duncan Smith was saying about universal credit and all of that. Who knows? But it's a very chilling. They are very, very chilling documents, and I wanted to get some of that flavour across in the show.
In terms of the drama of that particular episode, I'm sure many of you have seen it. We want to talk a bit about Victoria and Albert as people, and in the episode in question, Victoria is very concerned about the famine, and Albert's completely obsessed about the lavatories at Buckingham Palace because he's very interested in sanitation. And as you say, he started at home by trying to improve the plumbing. But it was an interesting characterisation of Albert, who's usually thought of as this very serious-minded man, and Victoria is slightly more frivolous. She's the one thinking in the big picture, and he's the one sort of showing the servants how the flushing lavatory works. Albert is portrayed quite sympathetically in the series, I think, but in that particular episode, he does come across as a slightly comic figure.
Well,
or is that not fair?
He's very interested in detail, Albert. He is obsessed with detail, and I have to say, he's the first man, one of the first people in the country to put in flushing toilets for the servants. And I do admire him for that. I mean, it's obviously not on the same level as famine relief, but to actually think that servants need, hygienic conditions too, I think is entirely to his credit. And the other thing, but when I talk about Albert in detail, so Osborne House, the incredible house he built on the Isle of Wight, in which he designed every single detail. One of the things I love is that in Victoria and Albert's bedroom, there is a special device so that when he gets into bed with his wife, he can lock the door from the bed, which I think, so it's got this special rod that goes all the way around the room, and he can just go ka-ching, and that means that, no children or animal or servants can come in. And I think that is really attention to detail. That's Vorsprung der Technik, He'd really thought that one through. I want to have some private time with my wife, No wonder they had 9 children. So I love that about Albert. And the other great joke about Osborne House, I don't know if anyone's been there, but in his bathroom, he's got this incredible, he's lying in his bath, and the picture he's positioned, and he positioned it there, of above his bath, is a sort of life-size picture of a naked Hercules being bound by a woman called Queen Omphale, who's also naked, and he's wearing a distaff, and it's like he's become her sort of slave, and you kind of think, well, yeah. So he does have a sense of humour, It's definitely a comment on his position, as he described it. He was always I am the husband, but not the master in the house. Yeah. So there's lots of little jokes like that, but the special sex lock I really like. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't mean to make light of the famine episode, but
no, sorry.
It was an interesting parallel, but. The sort of stereotypes of Victoria as sort of this funny little woman who's sort of totally unhooked her husband, and then Albert, the kind of very serious German with no sense of humour and all the rest of it. I think in some ways that episode kind of, you tried to move on from those stereotypes, because we were talking earlier about Victoria was a very empathetic person in many ways, despite having this very strange childhood and not much emotion. She did feel connected to her people.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel one of the 2 things about Victoria that that we can be sure of and make her very attractive to a modern audience is that she wasn't a snob. I mean, she really liked people who were not, who were from what they would have called the lower orders. But, some of her closest friends were her dressers. John Brown clearly was a very close friend indeed. Were not of her social class. And the other thing about her is she wasn't racist. She was fascinated in her subjects who came from foreign lands. So, and if you go to Osborne, it's full of all these beautiful pictures of sort of Indian princes. And she loved beauty wherever she could find it. I mean, she really liked a handsome young man. So, there's this wonderful picture in Osborne of Duleep Singh, who was the last ruler of the Punjab, who she sort of basically adopted and brought to court and had him there and looked after him. And she was terribly, she adored him. And, he was one of the many sort of, I suppose, Indians that she liked. And then obviously later on there was the Munshi, who became her Urdu teacher. So she was a really interesting character, because she isn't, you always think of her as sort of slightly submissive to Albert, all this kind of darling Albert, dearest Albert, but I think that's all for show. I think really their real relationship was extremely tempestuous. I mean, there's an incident that I put in the last series where she throws a glass of wine over Albert, and that actually happened. I found that in one of the contemporary sort of accounts of their life, and I just thought, wow, I never see that in any of the biographies, but I thought that's so interesting. They really had absolutely humdinging rows, usually over how they would bring up their children, or Albert would say, you're impossible, you're so emotional, you're so this, you're so that. And then he would sort of retreat, and she'd be infuriated by that, because what she wanted was a really good row, and he would sort of go all silent and not talk to her. And so they'd have these kind of furious letter exchanges, and then she'd sort of hunt him down and kind of harangue him. So they were a tempestuous couple, but obviously they obviously were physically very attracted to each other. I mean, I'm assuming 9 children means they were, there was something they still had it. Yeah. Still had it going on in the bedroom with the sex lock. So. And there's one thing. So after the birth of Princess Beatrice, in 1857, I think, who was their last child. Her doctor comes in and says, "Do you know, ma'am, you've got a prolapsed uterus," or she doesn't say that, but, and it would probably, you really should, stop, abstain. You can't have any more children. And Victoria's like, "What? No more fun in bed, doctor?" And that is, an absolute, she's absolutely horrified at this thought. So, the idea that Victoria is in any way, repressed, or, the idea that, Victoria was somehow against sex is just an invention of the early 20th century. Victoria herself was extremely interested in the physical side of life. So that was one of the joys of writing about her is that she's got such appetites, and later for food, the amount she ate was quite extraordinary. And if anyone's been to there's an amazing new exhibition at Kensington Palace where you see some of her dresses. And it's really interesting, her wedding dress is tiny. Her waist is literally like this. And then right up until the death of Albert, she keeps, she's had 9 children. It's still about like this. But then when you get to the 1880s and the 1890s, literally she's wider than she is tall. A pair of Queen Victoria's drawers from that era are extraordinary. They really are. They're wider than me. They are amazing. Anyway, it's worth having a look at. I do think costumes are a very telling thing, and Victoria really understood the power of clothes.
Yeah, that leads us on to sort of the visual of the series, but also Queen Victoria's use of clothes. And we were talking about research earlier, and you were saying that Victorian studies, most people doing Victorian studies don't want to know anything about Queen Victoria because it sort of gets in the way of they don't want to talk about the royal family or this woman because it gets in the way of the important things like empire. But actually, she is pretty central to the whole thing, and her use of image and her understanding of her own image is quite modern in a way.
I think so. I mean, one of the things you've got to remember about Victoria is, or one of the things I've come to realise about her is that she was a terrific creator of what we would now call her own brand. So one of the most interesting things about Victoria is that when she comes to the throne, she's always at home called Drina, and because her first name was Alexandrina and her second name was Victoria, so her mother and everybody else called her Drina. And when she came to the throne, there was this idea that she would change her name to something more acceptable for a queen, like Elizabeth or Anne or Charlotte or one of the sort of traditional names. But she says absolutely not. And I'm not going to be called Alexandrina either. I'm going to call myself Victoria, Queen Victoria. And I think that's fantastically interesting because I think she realises she wants to be called Victoria because it's nominative self-determinism, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically, she knows that this is a great name for her because it's a winning name, literally. Victory. It's got all these connotations of winning and being on top and all of that. And whatever you say about Victoria and whatever you say about how effective she was as a monarch, she was definitely right about that. She's given her name to the age, hasn't she? So I think that Victoria had this sort of, she really understood about the power of brand. So, for example, when she's the first monarch to be photographed. So in 1849, she and Albert become the presidents of the Royal Photographic Society. And in the 1850s, she's photographed. And it's hard for us now to imagine how revolutionary that must have been because if you think about it, until that point, the only images people would have seen of the Queen were paintings, with where she's wearing the crown jewels, whatever, or engravings from those paintings. And they would have seen very idealised pictures of her face. But then suddenly, they're able to see an actual photographic reproduction of their Queen wearing a bonnet. And that must have been extraordinary that suddenly they realised that this is a woman sort of like us. And I suppose the only the thing that I suppose in living memory comes close to it is if anybody remembers the documentary about the royal family that was made in the 60s where you see Prince Philip, barbecuing the sausages and, Queen Elizabeth kind of flipping the burgers and whatever. And I suppose that was, and everybody went, oh, they're just a middle class family just like us. Of course they're not. And of course Queen Victoria wasn't that, but it somehow made her more approachable to her subjects. And there she is with all her children and her husband and everything. And suddenly, instead of the monarchy being a very remote aristocratic institution that was literally gilded, that was covered in medals and gold and swords and cracked jewels, there they are wearing the clothes that most of the country are wearing, looking just like them. That must have been an absolutely seminal moment, I think. And it's one that's very not really written about, but I think it made a huge difference to the way that the British saw their royal family. And it's one of the reasons I think that, Victoria definitely saved the monarchy in Britain. I mean, if you think about it, 1848, all these monarchies were just sort of the year of revolution. All these monarchies were sort of toppling like ninepins. But the British monarchy stayed pretty secure. And I think that's because people recognised that Victoria was one of them to some extent. I think having a woman is important. And I think a woman, and also she's a woman who's having all these children while still being a woman, while still ruling. I mean, all of that, I think, has a huge effect on the psyche of the nation in the way that they perceive women and the way that they perceive the royal family. It's not a threat in the same way as it would have been, I think, if there had been a man there. Anyway, it's a very interesting question and one that isn't much discussed in Victorian studies, but I think makes a huge difference to the way that the monarchy is perceived in the 19th century.
This would be your feminist rewriting of Victoria, would it?
Yes. So,
as one newspaper described it.
Yes, when my first interview I did about Victoria, before it had even come out, I was sort of describing it to this journalist from the Telegraph, and he said, "Oh, so this is a feminist interpretation of Victoria?" And I was thinking, "Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to tell her story." And then I realised what that meant was you're a woman writing a story about a woman, who's also in charge. And somehow that's considered feminist. And I think one of the reasons that Victoria is so popular, especially among young women, is because how often do you see a young woman at the centre of a story who's the boss, who's not just the love interest or the glamour person, but is actually, the main engine of the story. And I think that is one of the most, that's one of the most interesting things about Victoria. And so many people have said to me, it's so refreshing to watch that, especially in a costume drama, and especially where, she's the one who does the proposing. She proposes to Albert. How often do you see that in a Jane Austen novel? It's like all those tropes of a 19th century novel sort of slightly turned on their head, but with the woman making all the running.
This is, of course, a history festival, and we have lots and lots of different people speaking about history, but yes, the main way that most people access history is through television, not through books or history festivals or podcasts, but through television. I wondered if you'd talk a bit about how people consume the series and, how they access the history that's behind the series. Well, I tend to get the reaction... quite often people go, yeah, no, I thought you'd made it all up. But then I went on Wikipedia and actually, you didn't. Actually, it's all true. And so that makes me quite happy. And then you said that someone actually said to you, does she marry him in the end? Yeah, no. Yes. There was quite a lot of... Because I was a bit worried that actually it would be very difficult to write this, it wouldn't be that interesting as television because people know the story. And then, they don't. Yeah, they don't. And somebody said, I met somebody who said, oh, who does she marry? Is it Lord Melbourne or is it Albert? So that's good. And so you have to work with that. And also, people are, you can never underestimate how much people know, because actually you'd be amazed at how little people really know. That doesn't matter. I'm not. I mean, and if you can fill in the gaps, that's fantastic. Because I'm delighted if people watch the show and they wiki and they Google as they go along. That is amazing. I've got a friend who's a history teacher, and she is so grateful for this show because she said that, she came into school one day and this girl in year 8 said, "Oh God, miss,
oh, you were right about the Chartists. They really did exist, And so I thought, well, that my work is done. Isn't that great? So, and, if it makes people curious, I mean, if it makes people curious enough to go and read something about Victoria or about the era, or make them aware of who the Chartists were, or was there really a black Chartist? Yes, there was. All of that, I think that's great. I mean, I think that's something that drama can do. So that's why I've tried to keep it as keep the details right. So in the first episode, there's a whole thing about the servants of Buckingham Palace selling tallow, the ends of candles, because they make some money out of it. That's all true. And it's this extraordinary idea of, this kind of trickle-down effect. So in the palace, they have fresh, new beeswax candles every day. And then the ends are taken off and sold to a slightly less wealthy family, and it goes down and down. And then, of course, the servants are using tallow candles that stink at the end. Or like, Queen Victoria would only wear a pair of gloves once. She takes them off. They are sold because, there's no mass production. So every pair of gloves is precious. They are sold down to a lady who isn't quite as wealthy, and they go down and down and down and down until they get to the rags and the pickers. So that's a fascinating. I thought the life cycle of a glove was a fascinating way of telling the story of the distribution of goods in Victorian times. And, hey, it's something we should all adopt again when we're all into recycling. So it's stuff like that I love. I love putting in those details, but you have to be very careful not to let the details get in the way. So one of the things I was telling Victoria earlier, in my first script, I'd written a whole scene between Victoria and a lion tamer called Macready, with a lion, obviously, because she was obsessed with this lion tamer, and absolutely obsessed with. She used to love going and seeing him, put his head in the lion's mouth and everything. And the first episode went through hundreds of drafts, and finally. And I said, well, I can't wait to see the lion. And everyone was looking at me. Finally, they said, it's time to discuss the elephant. We mean the lion in the room, Daisy, which is, this is never going to happen. You're never going to have a lion. And I was so disappointed. But in fact, they were right, because there was really no reason to have the lion in, except that it was a fantastic backdrop. But the point about a TV drama is that, unlike a novel where you can get away with sort of colour, every detail has to mean something to the story. Otherwise, you're thinking, why have they done this? It's what Chekhov said. If you put a gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1, you've got to fire it in Act 3. So you've got to constantly kind of knit all these details together. And that can be challenging sometimes, especially when you really, really, really want to have a lion or more than 3 soldiers or whatever it is. You've got to be disciplined with yourself.
That's a good segue into the fact that Series 3 has finished and potentially Series 4 is coming. Do you have to write thinking it's going to go the whole way through? I mean,
Series 4, yes. I mean, Series 4 is obviously, you can, that's going to be a heavy one, Series 4, because as anybody... no spoilers, but I think most people know that Albert does die.
No.
Yes. So I'm just going to break it to you gently. That's going to be quite a tough one, writing Series 4. I'm both looking forward to it as an artistic challenge, but also it'll be terribly sad. Not as sad, of course, as the death of Dash, which I was literally in floods writing the death of Dash. Yes, and I've said people were so angry with me for killing off Dash. They didn't mind about Lord Melbourne, but Dash. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic.